Hello and welcome to this webinar, which is a part of the Copenhagen Optimization talks. Today I'm going to talk about the efficiency of airports and really how that relates to the sustainability that we see in airports. Because one of the challenges of an airport is, to face it as it is, it's really the airlines and the aircraft that are doing the highest amount of CO2 emissions. But what can the airport do to really help drive a sustainable airport? So what we're going to talk about in this webinar is the way we see it is airports are emitting CO2 when they're creating new infrastructure. And that's really how we look at it being one of the main drivers of CO2 emissions of an airport. So the further we can help airports bring in life to their current infrastructure and really push out investments in new infrastructure, the better for the environment and the higher the sustainability. So how do we then look at this? So for this webinar, we've done some research into looking at the number of turns that an airport sees per contact stand, because building additional contact stands is one of the most expensive and most CO2 emitting investments of an airport. So we look at what is the current footprint on this and what can be done to actually improve the use of the current stand infrastructure in airports. So the research we did was we used public sources. So we used the data from ACI on the top 30 airports in the world in terms of passengers and movements in 2019. Then we also did research, a combination of Google Maps and the airport websites, to understand how many contact stands do an airport actually have. And a contact stand is defined as a stand where passengers can walk onto the aircraft. Most likely there will be a jet bridge. It could also be what we call a walk-on, where the passengers will actually have to go outside the building. And then once outside the building, they'll go into the aircraft using the air stairs. So based on that, we made two efficiency measures. One is the turns per stand per day, and the other one is the passengers per turn. So we want to look at this through two lenses. One is, okay, how many aircraft can you get onto that stand and then subsequently turn that aircraft around and get a new aircraft in? That of course talks about the efficiency. But the other thing is, are you doing that for a number of small aircraft or are you doing that for a number of large aircraft? Of course, the higher the number of turns per day and the more passengers per turn, essentially if you look at it from a per passenger perspective, the more efficient your airport will be. So let's look at the research. So what we did was we grouped these airports into 4 different categories. So one for North America, one for Europe, one for Latin America, and then one for the Asia Pac region. And what you see on screen now is a chart where the bars indicate how many turns per stand on average we found in each of the airports that we had in our sample. And then the red line depicts what's actually the number of average turns per stand. And then we split that up by region. So what we can see is if we look at the North American region, there's an average of just over 6 turns per stand per day, with the lower one being all the way down to 4, and then the top one being just over 8. And if we then go on to the European region, we can see that there's actually an average that is almost 1/3 higher than in North America, just over 8 turns per stand, which again indicates, okay, there may be some high efficiencies here. And then if we look at the Asia Pacific, that's actually the region where we see the biggest deviations or differences between the airports. So we see that's actually where we find the least efficient airport, at least measured from a turns per stand perspective. But we also see one of the most efficient ones. So a wider spread there. If we then go on and look at the passengers per turn, what we can see is that this is kind of upward sloping as we move through the region. So we see that in North America, it's about 110 passengers per turn. In Europe, it's about 140. And then in Asia Pacific, it's about 160. So how can we explain that? Well, part of it is definitely the fact that in North America, there's just more thin routes, right? The regional product in North America is typically served by smaller kind of CRJs or Embraers, whereas in Europe, even if it's a thin route, just because of the small geography of Europe compared to North America, you can actually fly that with a 737. And then you have the very populated, densely populated region of Asia Pacific, at least where the flights are going, in turn kind of driving up the passengers per turn. So overall, if we look at this, conclusion from our end is, well, if we look at North America, remember back from here, they did have the lowest number of turns per per stand, and they have the lowest number of passengers per turn. So looking at it just from the outside, and of course there are different factors that are driving this, and I'll come back to that in a bit, but that's why we have the lowest efficiency measured by a per stand from a per stand perspective. And then if we take Europe and Asia Pac, well, like Europe is somewhat more efficient when it comes to the turns per stand, but also with a slightly number of passengers on average per turn. So they're kind of on average there. So that's the overall research saying, okay, well, what if we could get all the airports to actually say hit the top 75% airport or so when it comes to turns per contact stand? What if we could drive that up in each region of the world, saying, well, okay, today I may be at a 4.5, but I have this other airport that is fairly comparable to me. They're doing 6. Let me look at what they're doing. So that's what we're going to talk about now, is really, okay, now we have the research in place. Now it's what to consider to get this going. So first of all, of course, the peak structure will drive a lot of this and your options for improvement, right? If we take this one, and then that's just an example, we look at an airport that has a hub carrier, and then they have essentially all the other traffic. Pretty typical for most airports in at least the top 30 in the world. So we could have, like, the dark blue could be the hub carrier, and the light blue could be all other traffic. And then what we want to depict with this small illustration is the fact that the hub carrier and all other traffic may not peak at the same time. So how are you catering for that as an airport? What if you have parts of your airport, maybe a full terminal, more or less dedicated to a single airline, and then you have the rest of your terminal infrastructure for handling all the other? Well, then you're essentially catering for 2 peaks, whereas if you were overlaying and saying, okay, what if I operated this with full common use on all the stands, how much more efficient would that be? So, of course, the peak structure and then the commercial elements around that, is not that we say that we think every airport in the world can just move to 100% common use right away, but there may be some options here to drive that efficiency. One opportunity to drive this is the use of the remote or hard stand operation in the peak period. So, of course, as a passenger, you prefer just to be able to walk out of the aircraft and not have to go out of the air stairs and then down into a bus and being bussed. But at the same time, especially in Europe, we see that almost all airports are using the remote hard stand operation quite frequently, and definitely in the peak period, to make sure that they don't build that infrastructure to use that one contact stand, say, 2 times a day. That's simply too inefficient. Then the hard stand operation can help. So what you see on here is just a snapshot out from Copenhagen Airport, where you can see there are certain stands where it's clearly a contact stand, and then we have some other stands that are the hard stands, where you can see some of the larger aircraft even are parked, and maybe this is for long-term parking. Maybe that was actually where the passenger operation took place. Another consideration is the common use versus dedicated use, and then you could extend that further and say maybe it's also preferential use. So the equipment that you have in the airport, and of course this has to do with the stands, but it essentially goes across all the areas, check-in baggage and the like. So to what degree is this dedicated to a single airline? To what degree is this shared among all airlines? Or is it more of a preferential use where you say, well, 90% of the time I'll give you exactly what you need, but the last 10% I really need that to make things more things more efficient. So how do you do that? To us, it really starts with what we call the terms of use. So the terms of use is really like, here's the playbook for operating at our airport. And of course, there's a lot of history, there's a lot of legacy on this. But if you start looking forward, it's like, okay, what if we started changing our terms of use? What if we actually start saying to the airlines, well, we as the airport operator, we're in control. Again, we understand there can be commercial considerations around this that makes that not possible. But again, think about doing it to the biggest extent possible. When it then comes to the infrastructure, because the infrastructure, of course, needs to support something like preferential use versus dedicated use. So if the computer is dedicated to a single airline, no one else can essentially use that infrastructure. So it's also about looking through, okay, here's my list of infrastructure in my airport, that being kind of the actual, of course, like a podium or like a podium at a gate to check in passengers for a flight, or similar, look at that and say, okay, well, the IT equipment that I have here, is that dedicated to a single airline, or could I actually put some applications in there so that I could use this gate for other than just one airline? Because the stand can be used for any aircraft, right? That's not airline specific. So that can be driven by whatever is happening inside the building. And then start to think about that and say, okay, yes, I'll give this to my main airline 90% of the time, but the 10% of the time where they're not in peak, I'll actually use it for something else. So that's an important consideration. An example here from dedicated versus preferential use. So in this case, we took a simple example. You have an airport, they have kind of two small piers, and you see one of them with a blue outline and one of them with a red outline. This could be a typical kind of dedicated scenario. Blue airline is to the north, red airline is to the south. We built this airport so that it caters for blue airline peak and red airline peak, but essentially we could now be at a point where we say, well, there's no more room for growth. In the peak, the blue airline uses all the stands, and vice versa with red. So we have two options. Option one, we could go ahead and say, okay, let's build a new pier. Or option two, we could look at saying, what if these two airlines peak were not coinciding? Of course, that's a governing factor here, but assuming they're not coinciding, what if red airline could get like 2 or 3 stands in the peak period that they have where blue is not peaking, and then vice versa when blue is peaking and red is not peaking? Then we would have to, of course, look inside the building. Well, can I actually support that from a building perspective? Can I actually get passengers to freely walk between these two piers? Because that would be a requirement for something like this to work. And then you can kind of work backwards from there. But that could be a good example of how going from dedicated to preferential use would then go back and ultimately increase the number of turns per contact stand. Then we have the considerations around the impact. So how are you going to impact this in your airport? Because we understand this is not an easy exercise. There's a lot of history. There's airlines that you have agreements with. There could be like handling agents. There could be other third parties. But to us, it's really about understanding it across these 3 dimensions. So one is situational awareness. Do you understand what's happening? Number 2 is influence. What can you do to actually make this happen? And then number 3 is control. So again, for certain areas, you may only be able to understand what's happening. So like the situational awareness could be the analysis that we did up front that we presented in the beginning of this talk, which is about, okay, well, currently I'm able to do X amount of turns per contact stand at this airport. And when you're at the airport, you can essentially do it per stand, right? So you can go in and say, okay, what are my most favorite stands? Where do I do the most turns, and where do I do significantly fewer turns? That's your starting point. Then you can say, okay, what can I influence here? Well, if Airline X, which is your hub carrier, essentially runs their operation themselves, that can be hard to influence right away. But the dialogue then becomes, okay, you want to grow. We have 2 options for growth here. Either we can help you by having you kind of get stands potentially somewhere else in the airport where these may be free, and then look at being more efficient. Or we could say, well, or we have to build additional, say, 5 stands, and that's going to cost you X amount of dollars. And of course, Airline X may not be happy about having to pay more, so maybe they're up for being a little bit more flexible. And then you could have another scenario where essentially you as the airport operator control the gate and stand allocation. That's the control scenario where you say, well, we know, and maybe historically the airlines have still seen themselves as having kind of dedicated infrastructure. Maybe they have like significant branding inside the terminal that means that other airlines may not be so happy to go out of a gate that's fully branded Airline X when they're Airline Y. But that may be what is required to make this puzzle work. So that's the control part where you as the airport can just go ahead and say, look, we are in control. We know you're not necessarily going to be happy but from both a financial and a sustainability point of view, we believe that having a more flexible way of allocating aircraft to stands will drive us to be able to extend the life of our current infrastructure, say 3, 5, 7 years. So how do you get going with this? assuming you think that this is interesting, but if you've gotten to this point of the talk, most likely. Step one is to make that initial analysis that we did like across all these airports with some fairly high level numbers. Do this across your airport. Understand what is the current use of infrastructure. That could be check-in counters, it could be baggage infrastructure, it could be stands, it could be gates. Whatever relevant area is, really get the baseline. Figure out, okay, what is actually the potential for me? Am I fully saturated in the peak, or do I have options for being more efficient? Number two is then understanding your stakeholder environment, because it may not be easy to do this. It could be a long pull, not something that's going to happen tomorrow, but over time, over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, if you start really pushing the ideas of being more efficient, both from a cost perspective, but also from a sustainability angle, this may really help drive that agenda inside your airport. And then the last one is then to say, well, you may come up with a list of say 10, 20, 30 initiatives. How are you then going to figure out what's going to give you the most bang for the buck? Where is it that you should focus? Where is it that you need to say, this is what we're going to do? Is it changing the stand allocation? Is it changing the check-in allocation? Is it saying, hey, I'm the airport operator, I'm now going to move from doing this on a seasonal basis to doing this day in and day out, and I really want to be more efficient? That's what you have to then figure out inside your organization, figure out, how do we do this? So to sum it up, we truly believe that there is much more efficiency to be gained around especially the kind of stand and gate allocation in airports. And it really comes down to, okay, can we move more towards preferential use? Can we move more towards being more dynamic and having shared infrastructure among the full airport operations? So if this is something that you found interesting, reach out to us. We're very happy to talk to you. We hope you found this inspiring, and thank you for listening.